Good afternoon, everybody. This is afternoon in Jakarta, Indonesia. Thank you for coming. My name is Eki Manjaya, and I will be the host of this lovely book webinar, which I also involved as one of the authors. Yeah, my name is Eki Manjaya. I'm from film department at Binus University, and today we will discuss about a brand new edit collection. Yeah, it's called Global Cult Cinemas, Decolonizing Cult Film Studies, edited by Ian Robert Smith, Dolores Tierney, and Shruti Narayan Swami as the editors. And today we are very happy that Dr. Ian and Professor Dolores already here to discuss about the uh, uh, the new book. Yeah, the book already launched few days before. Yeah, probably Ian and Dolores will talk a bit more about this. And we also have the contributor here. We have Nessa. Hello, Nessa. This one, yeah. For those who don't know, this is the list, the table of content. So today we will start by discuss why this book is important, and then about the colonizing movement. Yeah. So far we have the colonizing ASEAN film theories, and now we have the colonizing global cult cinema theories. And these are some of the contributors. And I think we all have Stephanie Denison right here. If you are the contributors, please give me a sign. Okay. For more details, you can just visit Bloomsbury website. And today we are very happy to have Dr. Ian Robert Smith and Professor Dolores Tierney to we will discuss about the book. Hello.
Hi, Eki. Thanks for
Yeah.
inviting us.
And I think the book was already launched few days ago, yeah, at the BFI or something. Yeah. How was it?
Yeah, it was really nice to be able to have a book launch at the British Film Institute in their library. But of course, one of the problems with book launches is that not everyone can make it to, especially with such a kind of international collection.
Yeah,
So to
yeah.
be able to have an online kind of talk with you is really fantastic. So yeah, thanks for inviting us, Eki.
Thank you.
Thank you, Eki.
Yeah. And before we continue, I would like to inform you that the discussion is recorded, yeah, so that later we can upload it to Binus Film YouTube. Yeah, I hope everybody is okay with that. Okay, without any further ado, probably first we can discuss about why this book is important, and then about the colonizing movement in film in the film studies. Yeah, probably both of you can start. Thank you.
That sounds good. Yeah, so would you like us just to talk a little bit about this and then we can present about it
Yeah.
maybe in 5 minutes or so? I mean, I guess the book is inspired by our, I guess, frustrations with certain aspects of cult film studies, cult film canon. Like we're both part of that. We've both written about cult and exploitation cinemas. We've edited books around that. But often we were kind of frustrated at how restricted the field was. Very kind of focused around the kind of UK and the US context. And even when the films are more international, the kind of audiences, the kind of cult fans tended to be based in the UK and US. And of course, I mean, Eke yourself, I guess I'm sure we'll discuss this later, like your work your PhD work was partly about that tension where like there are films made in loads of countries all around the world and they're becoming cult films once they reach this kind of Western audience. And so we wanted to do a collection that challenged that and complicated that.
Shall I say something quickly?
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, and equally, we wanted to maybe also think about the ways in which world cinema scholarship was also not really focusing on these films either. So we were also bringing in um, that the other field of looking at films that are considered world cinema or global cinema that are only thinking about the more art cinema or more prestigious genres of that cinema and leaving out popular exploitation or cult cinemas.
Okay, thank you for the introductory notes, Dr. Ian and Prof. Dolores. Now, before we move to the presentation of each chapter, I would like to read about the short biography. First of all, Dr. Ian Robert Smith is a senior lecturer in film studies at King's College London. He is the author of the Hollywood Meme, Transnational Adaptation in World Cinema, 2016, and co-editor of the collection of transnational film remakes, 2017, and media across borders. He co-founded the SCMS Transnational Cinemas, and he is currently working on a monograph on the global Hollywood movie poster. And he is also one of the editors of this edit collection. And then the other one is Professor Dolores Tierney, who also served as one of the editors of this edit collection. She is a professor of film studies at the University of Sussex. She has published on Latin American exploitation and horror cinemas, including the anthologies Latsploitation, Exploitation Cinema in Latin America, the one that I cited many times, and the Transcendental Fantasies of Guillermo del Toro, and chapters and articles in Cinema Journal, Porn Studies, and Routledge's Companion to Cult Cinema. She's also the author of Emilio Fernandez and New Transnationalism in Contemporary Latin American Cinemas, the co-editor of Ana M. Lopez Essays, and the editor of Studies in Spanish and Latin American Cinemas. Okay, so I will give the time to Ian first for about 15 minutes, yeah, and then followed by Dolores, and then myself, and then after that we will have a Q&A. Go ahead.
Great.
Yeah.
Great. Thanks, Eke. Yeah, so we'll do a little kind of intro to the book first, and then we'll get into our chapters. So I'll just I'll kind of share my screen so that you can see some of our slides. There we go. Okay. Here we are. Okay, so yeah, so as I was saying, like we're kind of partly responding to the kind of the canon of cult cinema as it exists at the time we're writing. So like in the 2011 BFI book, 100 Cult Films, the authors Ernest Matthijs and Xavier Mendick, they survey a selection of cult cinema as it stood, at that moment in 2011. So it ranges historically from the German expressionist silent film Cabinet of Dr. Caligari through to Martin McDonagh's black comedy In Bruges. It's got renowned classical Hollywood films like Casablanca and The Wizard of Oz, alongside more marginal titles like Freak Orlando and Blue Sunshine. And so Mendick and Matthijs are pulling together really a diverse breadth of examples that just try and grapple with, well, what is a cult film? Like it's these films that fans have become obsessed with, they're passionate about, that are somehow kind of alternative to the mainstream, that have some level of subcultural capital. And so they come up with this list of 100 titles. And while the book jacket promises that this is a trip around the world, providing a lively and illuminating guide to films from more than a dozen countries, the emphasis is very much on films from North America and the global north. So over half of the titles are from the US. There's three from Canada. A substantial proportion come from Western European countries, such as the UK. As you'll see, many of those are transatlantic co-productions with America. Nine from Italy, five from France, four from Germany. There's four from other European countries like Sweden, Belgium, and the Netherlands. Three from Australia and New Zealand. There are some East Asian titles, so five from Japan, two from Hong Kong. But as you can see there, the global South cinemas are largely absent from the selection. And perhaps most notably, no films from India, the largest film industry in the world by number of films produced every year. Now, there are exceptional cases. You've got there The Harder They Come from Jamaica, Lady Terminator from Indonesia. From Latin America, you've got two films, both of which are directed by Jodorowsky. And then from the entire continent of Africa, one film, The Gods Must Be Crazy. So 5 out of 100 from the global south. Now, I want to be clear, we're not claiming that this is a failing of that BFI volume. We're not saying, oh, this is like Mendick and Matthijs have made a terrible mistake in how they've put this together. We think this is actually fairly representative of the cult cinema canon at that time. Like they had to include many of these titles because those are the established films when people talk about cult cinema. But it's also a reflection of the predominant Western bias within that discourse. And it's that bias that we were wanting to challenge in our book. So the inclusion of a handful of examples from beyond the West is not really enough to make a category global, especially when the perspective that's framing those non-Western films as being cult is situated in the Anglophone West. So in our book, we argue we need to kind of challenge and interrogate the West centrism of cult cinema discourse, challenge the kind of hollow universalism underpinning some of the theories, the idea that you can just take one example of a fan group around a particular cinema in New York and then just use that to define the concept as a whole. So I think, yeah, that's what we were trying to do in this collection. I'll pass over to Dolores now, who can kind of take us on from here.
Hi, so I'm going to think about some of the challenges we encountered in a book that, as well as being about global cult cinema, is also thinking about decolonizing cult film studies. Starting then with the term decolonization and its significant limitations. Eve Tuck and Kei-Wayne Yang note decolonization should be about, quote, repatriation of indigenous land and life, end quote, not used as a metaphor for other things we want to do to improve our societies. As metaphor, Tuck and Yang argue, decolonization extends innocence and the possibility of a future to the settler, and also recenters whiteness. Can you, next slide, sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No, it's good.
Femi Taiwo argues decolonization has come to mean, quote, forcing an ex-colony to forswear any and every cultural, political, intellectual, social, and linguistic artifact, idea, institution that retains any aspect of the colonial past. Decolonization, Taiwo argues, is overtly binary and doesn't take into account African agency. There's also problems with the term decolonization and its appropriation by authoritarian forces, such as the Hindu nationalist right. So rather than like jettison this problematic term, right, this anthology has kept decolonizing as a kind of subtitle to the collection. And that's because, as Lindiwe Dovey, Anulika Agina, and Michael W. Thomas do in their contemporary African screen worlds, decolonization is still able to challenge neo-colonial structures of power and rethink the political underpinnings of our field. Next slide.
I think
Another challenge then for, oh no, same slide, you're right, sorry. Another challenge for scholars writing from the global north about the global south in terms of cult cinema is that we are aware of our own geocultural, classed and raced positions, or as Dovey, Agina and Thomas suggest, that we are, quote, conscious about how our subjectivity influences our research and interpretations. Simply put then, we need to decolonize ourselves. Cult film studies is already much more introspective and aware of what it did but could have done differently previously. Its next step potentially is to contest Eurocentrism by drawing from theorists and traditions beyond the global north and find ways of speaking from the global south in a more engaged manner, which means mostly countering an Anglophone emphasis in research by drawing on primary lect texts and in situ research, right? And I highlight from the chapters in the article, Galt's chapter on the Penanggalan, which uses texts by Global South scholars, or draws on local language knowledge, such as Jonathan Risner's chapter on Cine Bizarro in Argentina, or my chapter on that draws on Spanish language newspaper archives in the United States. Mostly then, decolonized work, we argue, has to draw on scholars working in the global south or draw on those epistemes, which the anthology has sought to do in chapters by Momina Masood, Valeria Villegas Lindvall, Loria Canepa, Eki Imanjaya. Okay. Rather than just acknowledge the limitations of cult film studies, we've sought to centre voices that have previously been marginalised to more fully address the global diversity of cult films and their fandoms.
perfect. Thanks, Dolores. Okay, so I'll move into my chapter, which is about this concept of the whiteness of cult. And yeah, it's one of the problems with these kind of discourses of cult cinema, the assumed whiteness of cult. And so in order to kind of illustrate and introduce that concept, I'm going to play you a music video. So we're going to try see if yeah, internet streaming will hold up with this. So I'll play you a music video from the American comedy musician Weird Al Yankovic. The song is White and Nerdy, parody of Riding by the hip hop artist Chamillionaire. And so while you're watching, look out for references to anything that might be considered cult. Here we go. So as you saw there, to illustrate the protagonist's nerdiness, Yankovic's lyrics make numerous references to cult fandom. So the Star Trek, only question I ever thought was hard was, do I like Kirk or do I like Picard? X-Men, I've been browsing, inspecting X-Men comics, you know I collect them. Monty Python, I memorized the Holy Grail really well, I can recite it right now, have you ROTF LOL. So these associations between white nerdiness and cult fandom are further solidified in the sequence where Yankovic initially appears to be purchasing drugs in an alleyway, but is instead shown to be buying a bootleg VHS of the infamous 1978 TV broadcast Star Wars Holiday Special. So the song satirizes the figure of the white nerd who is nerdy in the extreme and whiter than sour cream, and much of the humor of the video relies on contrasting this nerdy white fanboy with equally stereotypical black gangster figures. And it's no coincidence that the nerds in the video are white men, while the other prominent characters in the video are black men. There's a near absence of women within this construction of white nerdiness, and the comedy is very much built around opposing archetypes of racialized masculinity. However, it's important to note that two of the actors playing the black gangsters in this 2006 video are Keegan-Michael Key and Jordan Peele. Their subsequent comedy series, Key and Peele, was filled with pop culture references and sketches such as Ray Parker Jr.'s Other Hits and Gremlins 2 Brainstorm. And their career complicates many of the archetypal associations between whiteness and nerdism referenced in Yankovic's video. Jordan Peele, in particular, has established himself as a highly acclaimed director of genre films, such as Get Out, Us, and Nope. In an interview with CNN, he was described as a self-proclaimed black nerd, while in the New York Times he was portrayed as the figurehead of a contemporary movement of black nerds redefining the culture. Nevertheless, I would argue that there's still a dominant association between whiteness and nerdism that has underpinned the ways in which cult cinema has been written about and theorized to date. In a parallel to what Joanne Hollows has talked about as the masculinity of cult, I think it's past time that we address the whiteness of cult. Now, one thing it's important to recognize is I'm not arguing for an essentialist position here, which claims there's something inherently white about cult cinema and its fandom. I'm not claiming that all cult films are white, a statement that could be easily challenged by listing the many canonical cult films featuring non-white stars or made by non-white filmmakers, nor am I claiming that all cult film fans are white, nor even that all cult film scholars are white. There are a number of scholars of color who've made very significant contributions to the study of cult cinema, including Xavier Mendick, Robin Citizen, Eki Eminjaya, of course, Vibhishan Subba, and others. So it's the case that the cult fandoms, nevertheless, that have been centered within scholarship have been predominantly white. That doesn't mean that cult as a way of engaging with cinema applies only to that specific social formation. Instead, what I'm proposing is that there's been a default to whiteness in terms of how cult has been theorized. So Richard Dyer, in his book White, highlights the invisibility of whiteness as a racial position in white, which is to say dominant discourse, and that's of a piece with its ubiquity. And he argues that white people claim and achieve authority for what they say by not admitting, indeed not realizing, that for much of the time they speak only for whiteness. So there's been an absence of sustained reflection on the ways in which scholarship on cult cinema has tended to privilege certain kinds of white film and fandom. And I argue it's crucial we take steps to address the ways in which cult cinema has been constructed as white within our criticism, not only so that the whiteness of these theoretical framings is acknowledged, but so that we can work to dislodge whiteness from its assumed centrality and produce scholarship and film criticism that more adequately addresses the genuine diversity of cult films and their fandoms. Now, when I say that the whiteness of cult has been largely uninterrogated, I'm not saying that it's not been acknowledged before. Like Geoffrey Sconce, in his influential 1995 essay Trashing the Academy, argues that the paracinematic community, like the Academy and the popular press, embodies primarily a male, white, middle class, and educated perspective on the cinema. Similarly, David Church notes that the cult viewer demographic was and is primarily white, male, middle class, moderately to well educated, and roughly between the ages of 15 and 30. Meanwhile, in Cult Film as a Guide to Life, Ian Hunter notes, cult, with its obsession with lists, collecting, esoteric information, taboo breaking, and obscurity, always smacked of stereotypical masculinity. White men in black t-shirts obsessing about horror and sex films and the minutiae of censor cuts. So again, this construction of it's white and nerdy. That's the kind of the standard idea, the kind of dominant idea of who a cult film fan is. So there's been a specific social formation that's been centered within these theorizations of cult cinema. It's primarily their tastes that have shaped and defined the cult film canon. Now, there has been a limited amount of scholarship that attempts to think through the political implications of that kind of demographic. In her work on the white male fandom for The Big Lebowski, Barb Klinger argues that with its white male fan base, the case of The Big Lebowski suggests that cult is an exercise in taste with the power to signal and affirm gender, racial, generational, and other identities, not on the periphery, but at the center. And despite the various ways in which cult has been theorized as resistant and subcultural and marginal, scholars such as Klinger have drawn attention to the ways in which it also tends to privilege the tastes of a social formation that are far from marginal. Now, this is further complicated by the eclecticism of cult as a category. Like cult, it's so inconsistent how it's been defined. It's notoriously challenging to define. It's habitually used to refer to films from an unwieldy range of different genres and styles and budgets and nations and periods. Elena Gorfinkel poses the question, if Donnie Darko, Bad Girls Go to Hell, Robot Monster, Johnny Guitar, El Topo, Fight Club, Salò, and The Big Lebowski are all cult films, then what does cult film really mean as a framework of analysis? Like, how can it possibly be a coherent category if it encompasses such a diverse range of film styles and genres? Now, a number of scholars have argued that the concept of cult film is really not particularly useful as a framework of analysis, precisely because that imprecision of definition and lack of coherence. Sconce, for example, argues that the concept of a cult film is vague, problematic, and perhaps even misleading. And he argues that the coherence of the category lies not in the films themselves, but in the audience who are viewing them. Says the cult film phenomenon has less to do with a body of work than with the emergence of a particular reading protocol, unified only by the relative homogeneity of the social formation from which it arises. The audience tends to consist of white, middle-class men who've dedicated a significant portion of their life not just to watching movies, but to knowing about certain movies in incredible detail. Again, white and nerdy. And so by this argument, by this logic, this is what makes it cohere as a category. Like films as diverse aesthetically and thematically as The Big Lebowski, Cannibal Holocaust, Star Wars, and El Topo, they don't cohere on a textual level. There isn't a kind of unifying generic characteristic that ties all those together. But according to Sconce and Church and others, the audience for those films is more coherent and homogeneous. The people who are so kind of obsessed with them, knowing about them in incredible detail. So cult cinema is not only framed through the racial demographics of its fandom, but this homogeneity is one of the few unifying elements that help it cohere. Now, I argue we need to challenge that kind of hollow universalism and explore the way in which cult functions as a much more diverse category than has been acknowledged within scholarship to date. And I want to draw attention in my last few minutes to three strategies that other scholars have been undertaking that I believe might help carve out productive future directions for the field. So firstly, highlighting the diversity within the Western cult fandoms that have previously been framed through whiteness. So investigating the varied and complex relationships that people of color can have to cult cinema and its fandoms. I'm thinking here of Robin Citizen's work on the African-American fandom for Japanese cinema, for example. Secondly, expanding the canon by incorporating films that have a fandom predominantly amongst people of color. So scholars who have been looking at films that have tended to be excluded from the category, films like Friday, The Color Purple, The Wiz. So the work of scholars like Kristen Warner and Alfred Martin and others. And then thirdly, engaging more with cult films and fandoms outside of the US and UK in order to decolonize the category more broadly. So scholars like Vibhishan Subba in India, who's been drawing attention to the emerging cult fandom for Indian cinema within India itself and within the South Asian diaspora. So unlike lots of the scholarship on East Asian cinema that tends to still center the white Western fandom as being what qualifies these films as cult, Subba is instead drawing attention to the cult reception within the Indian domestic and diasporic fan communities. So these are all productive strategies that other scholars have been pursuing that I think have the potential to challenge that assumed whiteness of cult. But in discussing the whiteness of cult, I want to reiterate, I do not think that cult cinema should be defined by normative whiteness. Certainly, it's the case that the cult fandoms that have been centered within scholarship to date have been predominantly white, but that doesn't mean that cult as a way of engaging with cinema applies only to that specific social formation. As Richard Dyer argues in White, The point of looking at whiteness is to dislodge it from its centrality and authority, not to reinstate it. So I hope that my chapter in this book might encourage scholars to engage with cult outside of white fan communities and to avoid treating those non-white fandoms as being somehow outside of the norm. So that's my chapter. Okay, so thank you. And I think we'll pass on now to Dolores.
Unmute myself. So my paper's kind of responding to Ian's, although we didn't write them like that, but it kind of works that way, my chapter. So, reimagining the origins of cult cinema, Spanish language theatres and their audiences in 1969, 1970, New York City. So 1960s and early 1970s New York City was home to a dense and overlapping network of film cultures, ranging from exploitation and sexploitation screenings in Times Square, grindhouses like the Rialto. Sorry. It's not moving. Oh, sorry. Yeah. To late night screens of avant-garde underground cinema at the Charles on 12th Street and Avenue B. The first midnight movie El Topo screened at the Elgin, just north of Greenwich Village, and John Waters' Pink Flamingos took over the midnight spot at the Elgin in June 1972. These two films helped to establish many of the norms of what's now recognised as cult cinema. But this familiar cult cinema origin story is incomplete. Latin American films that were being screened in the same city at the same time, and often in venues nearby or even in shared neighbourhoods, are completely omitted. These films, particularly Mexican and Argentine sexploitation films, circulated through Spanish language theatre circuits that catered largely to working class migrant Puerto Rican audiences. Despite their proximity to the better documented cult film venues, these cinemas and their audiences have remained marginal in traditional English language histories of cult cinema. So my paper is trying to expand and challenge dominant understandings of cult film culture by examining their Spanish language exhibition circuits and audiences. It focuses on two exemplary cult films, the Isabel Sarli starring sexploitation film Fuego, it's 1968, and the Mexican wrestling horror and sexploitation hybrid El Vampiro y el Sexo. From cinema listings in the Spanish language daily El Diario La Prensa, we know that these films move through different types of theatres, from adult cinemas to Spanish language theatres across New York and the surrounding areas. Both premiering on the 29th of October, Fuego premiered at the Rialto on Broadway and 42nd Street, and subsequently moved on to 8 New York Spanish language cinemas in January 1970, before moving on to second bill at a variety of single theatres from February onwards. And El Vampiro y el Sexo premiered on the Spanish language circuit across 6 theatres in Manhattan, Brooklyn, and Bronx, lasting for 1 week, and subsequently also appearing at a succession of individual theatres throughout 1970. The distribution patterns of Fuego and El Vampiro y el Sexo reveal a parallel film culture that intersected with, but was distinct from the more widely recognised nascent cult scene. Ultimately, my chapter calls for a broader conception of cult cinema history that includes these non-English speaking and non-white audiences. It highlights how Puerto Rican and other Latinx viewers engaged with these films and points towards possible connections between these viewing practices and the wider political and cultural movements of the time, such as the Young Lords. This chapter reframes cult cinema as a more diverse phenomenon than traditional accounts suggest. While canonical cult histories describe the midnight movie crowd at screenings of El Topo as eclectic, pot-smoking and countercultural, more recent scholarship frames them as predominantly white, middle-class educated and cisgendered male. Robin Citizen, who Ian talked about, argues that dominant cult cinema framing overlooks non-white audiences, particularly Black and Latinx viewers who engage differently with genres that were later framed as cult cinema. For these audiences, martial art films such as Fist of Fury resonated not because of their strangeness or subversion, which are like key features of cult cinema viewing practices, but because they offered representation and identification for marginalized audiences, with Bruce Lee symbolizing resistance against oppression, colonial rule, or simply the man. Citizen scholarship helps draw a distinction between the Elgin attending white cisgendered male audiences and those attending Spanish language cinemas in New York, in theatres which were often located in lower income neighborhoods and serving working class migrant communities. New York's Spanish language cinemas form part of a national circuit catering to Spanish speaking audiences and the cultural needs of first and second generation migrants to the United States, living in Los Angeles, the Southwest, New Orleans, and Chicago. Theatres like the Azteca, the Olympia, and the New Delancey, where both Fuego and El Vampiro y el Sexo premiered in Halloween week of 1969, also have a role in cult film history and offer a more nuanced understanding of how and where cult cinemas were experienced. At the same time, there are connections between these parallel film cultures, as John Waters attests in a meeting with Isabel Sarli, sorry, I'm always calling her Beatriz, film for the Buenos Aires International Film Festival in 2019. He watched her films in the Spanish language cinemas with Divine and drew direct inspiration from them for his own work, not just copying Sarli's makeup for Divine in Female Trouble, but also copying Fuego's Broadway tracking shots filmed out of the window of a car for a similar Baltimore tracking shot in Pink Flamingos. Both types of audiences, Waters and Divine in the Latinx working class audiences, and the Latinx working class audiences, also form distinct viewing communities, united by a sense of difference from mainstream culture. Spanish language cinemas specifically fostered linguistic community among migrants, often reflecting nostalgia for their home territories, but also need for representations of a diverse Spanish-speaking audience they did not see in the world around them. In the New York City of post-World War II, where existing Spanish communities were growing, independent cinemas converted to Spanish language theatres, and some were renamed to evoke the Caribbean nations left by mostly Puerto Ricans, but also Dominicans and Cubans, to reflect broader ethnic communities based on shared culture and language. In East Harlem, the Arden became the Caribe, the Gotham became the Boricua, and the Madison, a small late-run movie theatre on the Upper East Side, became the Spanish language Azteca. As the listings in El Diario La Prensa attest, these cinemas also programmed other Latinx entertainment such as personal appearances, floor shows, and live music acts. By the late 1960s, audiences were increasingly comprised of younger second-generation Latinxes raised in the United States. This shift was reflected in film programming, which Diario La Prensa's carteleras reveal moved away from solely older comedies of Mexican ragamuffin Cantinflas and lucha libre films towards more explicit sexualized content like Fuego and El Vampiro y el Sexo, and also specially made for the US circuit Argentine films, as well as other Sarli films and films of other sexploitation styles like Libertad LeBlanc, in order to appeal to youth sensibilities. Note ads for the LeBlanc featuring real-life luchador El Santo. It's a repurposed version of one of the wrestling horror hybrids, Santo en el Tesoro de Dracula, in which Santo plays a scientist who invents a time machine and is forced to. El Vampiro y el Sexo adds topless female nudity and simulated sex, but is otherwise the same as the domestically released film. In New York, in particular, in the late 1960s, El Vampiro y el Sexo and Fuego slot in with the increasingly sexualized programming at the Spanish language theaters. Argentine producer Orestes Truco, who also distributed Bo and Sarli, was catering to the New York and New Jersey youth Latinx population by commissioning sexploitation and horror hybrids from Argentine director Emilio Vieira. His La Bestia Desnuda and Sangre de Vírgenes from 1967, also programmed for the 29th of October 1969, were made precisely for young adults, connecting semantically to the city. As Elena Gorfinkel points out, although sexploitation filmmakers often based in New York use the streets of the city partly out of economic necessity, working class locations, as quote indicates, and also specific sites linked to sex work and sexual exhibition, functioned less as passive backdrop, but instead Schaefer and Linda Williams, in Screening Sex, connect the rise in images of sex to late 60s societal and political shifts, the sexual revolution and dissent, linking sex with the countercultural ideologies of anti-racism, anti-war, anti-capitalism, and anti-patriarchy. To incorporate the substantial Spanish-speaking audience in the United States and the particular political goals of the radical youths within that audience, we can also add in to this tally of countercultural ideologies anti-colonialism. While independent theatres in New York, inner city neighbourhoods, had changed their content and names to suit the audiences created by waves of immigration through the 40s, 50s and 60s, New York City's public institutions and bodies had neglected the Latinx inhabitants living in its central boroughs, like East Harlem, creating structural inequalities of sanitation, education, healthcare, housing, and employment. Puerto Ricans, Dominicans, and Cubans had been forced to leave their nations due to US policies and investments on the islands and encouraged to come to the US, to cities that were desperately in need of blue-collar workforce. Once in New York, however, and as attested by Fernandez in The Young Lords, A Radical History, and in Palante, the newspaper of the New York Young Lords, Puerto Ricans experienced inadequate housing, poor healthcare, discrimination, racial profiling, police brutality, and low-wage jobs. The screening of sexualized films in Argentina of 1969 and early 1970, like Fuego in El Vampiro y el Sexo, coincides neatly and geographically with the rise of the Young Lords, founded in East Harlem and modelled on the Black Panthers, who promoted community engagement and action, organised protests, ran healthcare programmes and black breakfast clubs. As a way of countering structural inequalities, discrimination and poverty, a 21st of December headline, Lucharemos, which means we will fight, in El Diario La Prensa, listed alongside sexy films, recounts the white and black young Puerto Ricans in East Harlem being beaten up by the police. The article is referring to the young Puerto Ricans' struggle to use East Harlem's first Spanish United Methodist Church as a space to feed breakfast to poor children before school. The priest, in exile from revolutionary Cuba, denied the group entry to the church. In early February 1970, the Young Lords eventually barricaded themselves inside and began their program of community works. The screenings of El Vampiro y el Sexo and Fuego across the autumn and winter of 1969-1970 happened at the same time and in the same neighbourhood as the youth-directed political mobilization of New York's working class and predominantly Puerto Rican communities. They also happen alongside the rise in screenings of other non-Spanish language sexy films that are part of New York City-based art cinema and countercultural scene, such as I'm Curious Yellow, also advertised in El Diario La Prensa. Is it possible to draw a line of connection between the left-wing ideologies of the Young Lords and the popularity of these films, in the same way that cult film scholarship draws a connection between films like Curious Yellow and the counterculture? The relatively liberated sexuality of Fuego and El Vampiro y el Sexo suggests it is. In addition to community and work and cultural education, fighting sexism and homophobia and more liberated ideas of sex than those inherited from their Catholic parents, was also part of the young law's fight against social conservatism. In addition, we can also theorize the progressive sexual politics of some young lords along more sexual and anti-capitalist lines, more political, and anti-capitalist lines. In May 1970, in Women's Oppression, Cortejas, in Palante, Connie Morales criticizes the Puerto Rican community gender norms, which expect a woman to be pure and remain pure for the rest of her life, meaning no sexual pleasure. Morales goes on to exhort the Puerto Rican men to realize that the machismo, which demands female submission and no sexual pleasure, is an expression of capitalism. El Vampiro y el Sexo and Fuego, which explore female pleasure, fit in with this leftist position of the young lords and the broader sexualized counterculture in New York. So my chapter then is examining Spanish-speaking audiences in New York, watching films like El Vampiro, El Sexo and Fuego in 1969 to 1970, and challenging the idea that cult cinema audiences were exclusively white and countercultural. It argues that these viewers, largely Puerto Rican and other Spanish-speaking migrants, experience this nascent cult cinema differently, finding pleasure not just in strangeness of Hollywood norms, but in themes of sexual freedom, self-recognition and resistance, shaped by their marginalized social position. Although I'm expanding the history of cult cinema by including these films and these cinemas, these theatres, like a lot of subaltern histories, there are gaps and absences. It suggests that films played a role in the cultural and political moment of Puerto Rican communities in New York, and still presents a broader, more inclusive account of cult cinema's beginnings, highlighting the importance of non-Anglo audiences and their distinct viewing experiences. Okay. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for Ian and Dolores, yeah, Prof. Dolores and Dr. Ian. Thank you for a very interesting and lovely presentation. Before we move to other topic, yeah, which is my presentation, I want to say hi to Nessa Johnston and Stephanie Denison, who are also fellow contributors. Yeah. Hello, Nessa and Stephanie. Thank you for coming. If you want to add something, probably after my presentation, you can share a bit about your research. Yeah. Okay. We still have about 30 minutes to go. Yeah. So I will do a presentation like in less than 10 minutes, I hope. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Yeah. So probably some of you already know that my research, my doctoral research is about crazy Indonesia. So I think it's time for me to move on beyond crazy Indonesia. So when Ian challenged me to contribute to this lovely edit collection, so that's where I think, oh, that's the time. So it's called Beyond Crazy Indonesia, Reframing Cult Cinema from an Indonesian Perspective. For those who is not familiar with the term cult movie, yeah, for my students, yeah, a cult movie is simply, I don't know, simply put, has a dedicated, passionate fan base, yeah, or militant fans, and remain popular through repetitive viewing and ritualized subcultural celebration. And then in Indonesian case, particularly in back in the 2000s to 2010, Barry Kitgren and Timothy Corrigan have the terms like mass cult and cult blockbuster, which are like a mainstream blockbuster but have a very militant following. So I start with my research about Crazy Indonesia. So it was Joko Anwar who told me about there are some Indonesian films from the 80s and 90s got redistributed overseas, in European countries and in America, US, and then the films were labeled as cult abroad reworked by international distributors such as Mondo Macabro DVD and then Trauma Entertainment, and then it still continues with this one is from Mondo Macabro, and then Santet is from Terror Vision. So the term cult movies were not used or were not recognized in Indonesia until recently, until like 5 or 10 years ago, And then this raises key question of my research. For example, does Rocky Horror Picture Show considered as cult in Indonesia? Because I don't think many people know about this movie. But the film with the 100 cult movies, Javier Mendik and Ernest Matthijs. So what is cult movie? And based on my research, I found some difficulties to frame Indonesian cases with the cult film theories, Western-centric framework. For example, Indonesia, we don't have midnight screenings, but we do have layar tancap or traveling cinema. And we didn't have any, for example, cosplay or Comic-Con until recently, until 5 years ago. And then, there are some of international distributors. Other include Vinegar Syndrome, Severin Films, and they target Western audience. That's why they reward the particularly by proportional materials. From this framework, they excluded dangdut musicals and comedy bar warkop, the two cult icons that are primarily celebrated massively in Indonesia, but not in abroad, And since the distributors rework the materials, the promotion materials, so the films were partially understand, and they were shift away from their original cultural or social context of the film. So that's when I decided to undertake research on some cases that remain unexplored. So move beyond Western definitions, and I center Indonesian perspective, both the Indonesian filmmakers and Indonesian audience or fans, and I try to expand meaning of cult. So from imported label to locally adapted concept, and then cult in my chapter becomes global and local. So for me, there is no pure cult cinema. It's according to the context, of the region, and always transnational. Okay. So in Asian context, the decolonizing time challenging the Orientalist lens, where Asian films are only cult because of their reception as exotic otherness in the West. So I will start first with Joko Anwar Hatan Slave. As I mentioned earlier, Joko Anwar is the spokesperson of Indonesian cult films being recirculated abroad, including the classic Hatan Slave, Lord of the. So Joko is an author fan, and he is the spokesperson, and I thank him because he was the one who introduced me with this kind of Indonesian transnational classic cult movies. But apparently in 2016, 2017, Joko Joko dreams come true ya, Joko quote wet dreams ya come true ya when he remade the Pengabdi Setan or Satan Slave, and that's the point where this is the starting point of a new kind of cult movies, because the films, the classic film was considered as cult, and then he remade the film with his own ways, yeah. So he reclaimed the legacy of New Order era horror and repremise for modern digitally connected Indonesian fandom. So he become the bridge to the past and the present, and legitimize cult movies in Indonesia. The second one is Nayato. Nayato just passed away sadly few days ago. I think it's a week ago. He is the role is productive precarity and rational aesthetic. So he could make 2 or 3 films parallelly in 3 days in one location. That's crazy about him. Yeah. So and then in 3 days he will produce three different films with a very low budget. Time, yeah. So the Nayato is ignored by critics but celebrated by fans, and he has so many names, yeah. Koya Pagayo, Pinkan Utari, and many names. His work is often evaluated through the lens of paracinema and aesthetic of badness that challenges mainstream taste distinction. And Yayato was rediscovered by because that's the importance of transnational Indonesian classic movies. So people are aware, oh, there is such thing like Indonesian cult movies, and then they try to find their own perspective of cult movies. So they rediscovered the Nayato, yeah. And then Nayato is a very productive filmmakers, and not every film of his work was good, yeah. But I think he made the way, the pathway to become cult, yeah. And partly because of the Kolong Cinema's attempt, and I will discuss about Kolong Cinema later on after this. Why Nayato matters is from the 2000s. His films are not part of crazy Indonesia things and local recognition, and not dependent on Western validation. So it's their fans, who do the campaign, like, hey, this is cult, and so on. And then the third one is Azrak. Azrak is considered as the new cult, yeah, cinema. It's so bad, it's good, a movie, and unintentionally bad because the film director considered the film as a good, yeah. But its cult status emerged not from traditional quality, but from its perceived precarious production values and unintentional humor. It's very absurd, yeah. And when I watched the film, so the film is gone. The director didn't want the director didn't want to to put the film into Netflix or something like that. Either I mean, there were some attempts, even a petition to put the film into Netflix, yeah. But he said no. But when I watched the film as a secret cinema in Kino Forum in Taman Ismail Marzuki, I watched the film, and because the programmer is my friend, and hey, do you want to watch Ashraf? Is a secret cinema, is secret movie. So I watched it, and as if I watched the experience as if I watched the Rocky Horror Picture Show for the first time, where the participation of fans or audience are very high. They scream, they comments, they make a soundtrack out of it and something like this. It's very very interesting experience as the audience. And then even they have sahabat Azrak or sahabat Azrak's friends, yeah. This is like a local cult emergence. So if you Google Azrak, so it's like you can find the Indonesian new cult, new wave. So it's also independent from Western gatekeepers, yeah, from Western perspective and homegrown cult film. And the last one is Kolong Cinema, is by Azam Firullah and Merdeka Alzai, Azam and Deka, yeah. They were the ones who campaign about Nayato and then about the trashy films and trashy soap opera, midnight opera, yeah, midnight soap opera, or what that we call it sinetron, cinema electronic, very so that it's good. So they, as fans of these bad films, and they proclaim themselves as bad B-movie director, and they they said they were inspired by bad movies from the past and from Nayato's time, the 2000s. So it's and not only that, they became the advocate, yeah. They traveled all around Indonesia from one film community to another to campaign about this trashy taste, yeah. And apparently there are so many people, are very interested in joining, and even they, nowadays we have festival film jelek, the festival of bad films, because the organizer, the programmers thought that there are many short films being rejected many times of so many film festivals, so they decided to make these films. I think it's one of them is inspired by Kolong Cinema. So it's intentionally bad films, not like in a New Order era, Susana or Barry Primas films, Lady Terminator. They try to make good films, yeah, but turned out the Western people thought that it's so bad it's good, and then but Kolong Cinema intentionally made bad films with so what attitude. What I mean by so what attitude is, hey, I make this bad film, so what? So they became the movement became bigger and bigger, yeah, all over Indonesia. So trash film fan movement, yeah, they made it like a trash film fan movement. As Lo says, they are self-aware, the movies production, but they call it B movies, yeah, instead of cult movies. They even have this pocong, sharp pocong and so on. And the universe of Indonesia, and reconnecting or discovering and defending Nayato's chip and CC soap opera and so on as an advocate. And they even collaborate with other production houses like Mercusuar, and there are like Hollywood, yeah. They have some other movement like Cinema Kacang Goreng or Parade Film Jenglot. Jenglot is a tiny monster, it's like a voodoo or something, yeah, voodoo tulsi, Jenglot. So I will conclude that Western theory is limited because they need to decolonization from non-Western perspective. So we need to develop that. I agree with Ian and Dolores. Yeah. And Indonesia film directors and Indonesian audience reshape the concept. Yeah. So cult movies is locally negotiated. I think that's all from me. Thank you. So before we move to Q&A, we still have about 15 minutes. Yeah. So if I may, I will ask Nessa and Stephanie to share, yeah, if, yeah, Dolores and Ian, if you don't mind, yeah, because they are here, like 5 minutes each, yeah, about the chapters that they already wrote for the edit collection. Please share with us. Probably nice stuff first. Are they here? Oh, they still here.
I think maybe Stephanie's gone. So maybe we could
Stephanie
just.
had to go. She messaged me. She had another meeting,
Ah,
so
okay.
she had to
Maybe
go. But she
if we
was
all
here for most of it. I'm really sorry. She was here for most of your talk. Eki, she had to
Okay.
go. She
Okay.
messaged me separately. I
Okay.
think
So,
Nessa's here. Maybe spotlight Nessa or tell Nessa.
yeah. Nice.
Sorry, I can't. I'm afraid I can't put my camera on because I've got quite an unstable internet connection. So sorry about that. I haven't really formally prepared anything, so just speaking off the cuff. Just to say, my chapter is about Roger Corman in Ireland. So it's a bit of an unusual one, really, in that Ireland occupies a sort of unusual place, really, in any dialogue on sort of the colonial situation and decolonizing cult cinema. But I thought that the case of Roger Corman's Irish studio was very interesting in this context, because his studio in Ireland was active from 1995 up until 2000, which represented a period of profound economic change in Ireland, where it went from being a very marginal economy to being a very wealthy one in a very short space of time. But the other reason that it was interesting was because one of the conditions for the support by the Irish government of Roger Corman's studio was the working language of the studio be Irish Gaelic, and that it be situated in the west of Ireland in an Irish Gaelic speaking community. So from a kind of colonial, post-colonial perspective, this is very interesting, given that although Irish is the official language of Ireland and it's still actively spoken by a lot of people, it's still a majority English-speaking country. So this sort of nods to the kind of post-colonial situation and a sort of decolonizing process, I thought was interesting, even though it was adopted really for very cynical reasons by Corman, who just wanted to tax rates and this subsidy. But naturally, because there's a collection concern with culture, I'm also interested in reception. One of the reasons I was so interested in Corman's Irish studio was because I was very aware of it in the 1990s when I was a teenager, because there was a lot of fanfare around the opening of it, the job creation, and Hollywood comes to Ireland and all that kind of hype. And then there were no films. Like, where are the films? I know they're making films, where are the films? But it was because they were being made for the straight to video. And they weren't being shown in any cinemas in Ireland, with one exception, which I'll discuss in the chapter. But what's happened in more recent years is that the films have been discovered by Irish people, like purchased on eBay or whatever, on YouTube, and then during the COVID-19 pandemic, lockdown screenings, and you could sort of look at a lot of the comments on YouTube, sort of live tweeting, and threads on Reddit and so forth, and see how Irish audiences were engaging with these films and enjoying being able to sort of recognise Irish locations in these genre films, and being really happy to find sort of trashy genre films that were Irish, and sort of feeling like that Ireland could be part of that. And so, yeah, that's basically what my chapter does. So that gives you a bit of an overview, and I was glad to be a part of this collection and kind of have it in this amongst so many wonderful contributions from around the world, and hopefully sort of speak to those other experiences.
Okay, thank you very much, Nessa. I think your chapter is very interesting. Yeah, I'm yeah. I can't wait to watch you to read all the chapters on the book. Yeah, if I hope I can get the book. Yeah, so thank you.
Yeah,
Okay.
Erky, I'm really sorry you haven't got your copy yet. I will chase again today because
Oh,
I have been chasing
no
because
problem.
I've heard that no one has them apart from
Yeah.
me and Ian.
Yes. Okay. If any of you have any question or comments, please do drop it on the comment section or open your mic. It can be about one of the chapters that we already presented or the book in general is also fine. We still have like 10, 15 minutes. Yeah. Any? Okay, Julita or Juju, please ask away.
Hi, can everyone hear me well?
Yeah.
First of all, I would like to congratulate all of you for the book. It was truly nice to finally have a book about cult films that have a spirit to decolonize or criticize the main idea about cult cinema itself. Because like every time like I saw like 100 best cult film you must watch or like that came from like a proper institution like they say like British Film Institute that being mentioned by Ian before or only from like one scholar that said about this cult films. I was like, how can like this idea of cult film be defined by an institution that kind of like I don't know. I always imagine like British Film Institute is such a close institution, and I really admire if like this idea of criticizing or decolonizing or even de-westernizing also comes not only from the center but also from the periphery outside the center. So I really like the spirit of involving global South film scholars to make this book. So yeah, I really enjoy all of you guys' presentations. Because for me, as I don't know, maybe I consider myself as a film scholar slash media archivist. Even the idea of archive, or let's say my interest about women films, uh, it seems like like the hegemony is really strong, and it always centralized again in the center of the white culture, like again like US and UK. So I found that I think like right now is the time for let's say like a global South film scholar. Yeah, I really happy like I think can be a representative of Indonesian cult cinema in here. But I found that it's important to like always re-narrating against the main narrative or convention to understand about let's say like a classical cinema, cult cinema, or women cinema that come together. Yeah, maybe I want to say about that, and maybe I was wondering the things that mentioned by Dolores about Argentinian film, the exploitations. I ever get exposed also. Maybe it's not Argentina, but it's also like Southern America, like Brazil. They have this exploitation film called Porno Chanchadas, if you ever heard. And also like in Indonesia, Eki also mentioned about the 1970s and 1980s during the New Order era, where the sexploitations, especially for like 1990s, it was increased a lot. I was wondering like how you guys connected this authoritarianism that happened in some countries region with this the stream of sexploitation be in cult films. And because I was wondering like is it some sort of like is there any pattern with you know the relation between authoritarianism and this being exploited in films. Maybe that is from me. Thank you.
Thank you. You. It's a very good question. Anyone to ask?
I can say a
to
tiny bit. It's a
answer?
real shame Stephanie had to step away because Stephanie's chapter that she wrote with
Oh,
Laura Canepa actually talks about Raffaele Rossi
mm,
and to a lesser extent about José Mujica Marins, who both made porno chanchadas during the Brazilian dictatorship, right? So something different happens in Brazil to what happens with Mexico and Argentina, where authoritarian and the kind of family kind of Catholicism in Argentina and Mexico meant that sexy films weren't made for the domestic audiences, but were made to be exported for the US English, sorry, the Spanish language markets. But in Brazil, there was a kind of, and Stephanie can talk to this much more because Stephanie Dennison has written about this both in this book, but also elsewhere in Blaxploitation, Eki, about a particular situation in which there was a kind of an enabling of the development of much more explicit films in the porno chanchada, which are a bit like comedies, which become much more explicit from the 80s onwards. And I can't really say much more because Stephanie's not here. But the reason that they're so different is the dictatorship didn't have ideological family-oriented ideologies of Catholicism for various reasons, which I can't really think of right now. So there was a slight difference in the authoritarianism, but it's also partly an appeasing, I think, of a group by sort of having this kind of great opening up of you can see whatever you want at the cinema. The kind of hidden, we'll let you get away with it thing in Brazil that was going on. Yeah, but all three of those countries were experiencing dictatorship. That's a really great question, Julita, and I'm really sorry that Stephanie and Laura's not here. I think it's really hard for our people in that hemisphere because time-wise, it's really early in the morning for everyone in Canada and Brazil and everywhere who could come on. Yeah, so hopefully once the book gets to Eki, he can maybe let you see that chapter. But you should also look in Blaxploitation, which I think Eki must have, because there's a chapter by Stephanie in there too, called Sex and the Generals. Okay.
I think everyone here should propose their own, university library to buy at least one, so we can share, and read the book. Ian, do you have something to add?
Well, I guess just to respond to Julita's very kind comments on what we were doing as a whole, because I think, yeah, we were very kind of conscious in putting together the collection that what we wanted to do was, yeah, invite scholars from a variety of countries around the world to think through what cult means within that specific national context, and also to grapple with the ways in which sometimes it doesn't really work as a useful framework. So Mamina Masood's chapter about cult in Pakistan is partly about the ways in which these kind of Western theorizations of cult cinema don't really apply in the context of cinema in Pakistan. And she kind of theorizes in a really kind of elegant way the kind of problem of imposing a kind of Western framework of kind of saying like, oh, okay, yeah, vaguely similar in Pakistan, cult, like let's just calling a Western work on a one of the reasons I chat he was kind of talking through there was that there's a really interesting way of yeah, removing the kind of Western gatekeeper figures and kind of thinking about what cult is actually meaning for fans and filmmakers and audiences within Indonesia, rather than it always being framed through kind of Western gatekeepers, because yeah, inevitably that has often been the way in which it has been theorized. Like Lady Terminator is the one Indonesian film on that BFI list because Pete Toombs and Mondo Macabro released it on DVD in the UK and US. Like it's the one Indonesian film that all of these Western cult film fans have seen, and it like yeah. So I think we wanted to try and challenge that while also being aware of the limitations of that as a framework.
Okay, thank you, Ian. We have 2 more minutes? I think one last question, if any of you have like comments or questions, yeah, before we wrap up. And don't forget we need to do photo groups, and for Binus students, you need to fill in the exit ticket. Yeah. Any other question? If not, yeah, we can wrap it up and take a picture. Yeah, take a picture. Okay. Okay. Thank you very much, Dr. Ian Smith and Professor Dolores Tierney. And for the rest of the conversation, the discussion, we will upload it to YouTube, yeah, Binus Film YouTube. And it's time for us to take a photo group. Photo group. Okay. Don't move, don't move. Don't move.
So open your camera. Ini mesin. Okay, we're gonna start from page 1. Okay, 3. Ada 2. Satu ya. Oh iya, satu dong. Oke. 3, 2, 1. 3, 2, 1. 3, 2, 1. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much for coming, particularly for Professor Dolores Tierney and Dr. Ian Smith and everybody else. Yeah, it's the end of our discussion.